Hi, this is Imari from the Always Uttori blog, where we empower you to bring enchantment into your life through fashion, food, DIYs, and lifestyle content. Today, we're wrapping up our Christmas in the Greenhouse theme with a collection of DIYs inspired by our Apothecary color story. This theme celebrates nature and biophilic design, featuring a traditional holiday palette of greens and neutrals with playful pops of red. If you missed our Decorate With Me video, where we styled the greenhouse using these DIYs, be sure to check out the link in the description below. We've got plenty of projects to share today, so let's get started and create some enchantment. We're starting with floral-inspired baubles. This style is super popular right now. You've probably seen similar ones at places like Anthropologie or on Pinterest. The good news, they're simple, quick, and budget-friendly to make. I used clear baubles I picked up at Hobby Lobby last year, a pack of 24 for just $12.99 during a half-off sale, making these about $6 for the lot. You can also get these at Dollar Tree in sets of 2. I experimented a bit with how to fill the ornaments and found that adding a bit of craft wire works best. Twisting the wire into a spiral helps create structure inside the bauble, evenly distributing the dried botanicals so they don't all clump at the bottom. Plus, the wire adds a touch of shine and visual interest. Next, I added dried botanicals. I used a mix of leftovers from previous projects, including dried cedar tips, some dried hydrangeas from my yard, and a mix of dried flowers I got from Amazon. But I think straw flowers worked best. They're vibrant, textured, and add a beautiful pop of color. Once I filled about 20 ornaments, I tied tan and gray velvet ribbons through the ornament loops to create elegant hangers. These ornaments looked beautiful hanging on the tree, and the clear baubles caught the light, adding to the apothecary feel of the theme. I was inspired by these Christmas tree ornaments and Santa picture I saw on Raz Imports, a wholesale home decor supplier. While I liked the look of the glass ornaments, I had leftover cedar shingles from building our greenhouse and decided this would be a great project for leftovers. Cedar shingles are a fantastic crafting material. They're thin enough to cut and manipulate easily, but sturdy enough to hold up for projects like this. Because they're shingles, they taper slightly, being thinner on one end and thicker on the other. You can purchase a pack of cedar shingles from most home improvement stores. I got mine at Menards for about $16 per pack, which covers 12 square feet, plenty for multiple projects. If cedar shingles aren't available, you can also use wood pieces from Dollar Tree or even substitute with cardboard or thick cardstock. I used a test print to determine the size of my wood pieces, settling on approximately 4 by 3 inches. You can adjust the size based on your preference and the images you plan to use. I used the image as a guide to cut my wood pieces to size. Next, I gave each piece a light white wash using chalk paint in the color oatmeal. I thinned the paint with water to create a translucent effect, enough to bounce light off the surface so the image would pop, while still maintaining the natural wood grain. After the paint dried, I lightly sanded the edges to smooth out any jagged or rough spots. Originally, I tried stamping botanical motifs onto the wood, but the ink smudged under the glue, so I switched to brown wax instead. Using a dry paintbrush, I buffed the wax into the wood in circular motions around the edges, creating an aged vintage effect. I print and cut out images I made with Adobe Firefly AI. I was inspired by the vintage Santa and also created some taxonomy-inspired mistletoe, holly, and a Christmas tree. If you'd like to use the same images, I'll include a link in the description for free downloads. Initially, I wanted to print on rice paper, but it was too difficult to feed through my printer. Instead, I switched to vellum paper. Vellum has a lovely transparency that allows the image to blend beautifully into the wood. I found that to print on vellum, it's best to use regular print settings unless your printer has a less ink option. If it does, select that, as the more ink, the easier it is to smudge. Let the vellum dry for 5 to 10 minutes before handling, as the ink can still smudge. Using Mod Podge, I attached the images to the wood. I found it worked best to paint the wood with Mod Podge, place the vellum image on top, and seal only the edges and corners rather than the entire image. This helped reduce wrinkling. Once dry, I used sandpaper to smooth out any large wrinkles and lightly distress the edges for a rustic vintage look. I cut pieces of tan velvet ribbon about 4 to 5 inches long and attached them with hot glue to form hangers for the ornaments. To give the ornaments a polished look, I added a burlap backing. I upcycled burlap from an old flour sack, and when that ran out, I used burlap ribbon. Using hot glue, I attached the fabric to the back of each ornament and trimmed off any excess burlap, following the natural contours of the wood pieces. For the ribbon, I overlapped the two pieces and trimmed the excess. This final touch really elevated the look of the ornaments, giving them a high-end rustic charm. This project is inspired by the charming small tin bells that have recently become more popular than the oversized cowbells of years past. While they're not too pricey to buy, I realized they'd be fairly easy and fun to make using aluminum cans. Start by cutting the tops and bottoms off of some aluminum cans with scissors, then cut down the sides of each can to create a flat aluminum sheet. Using a 2.5-inch hole punch, I cut out circles from the aluminum sheets. You can do this freehand with scissors, but the hole punch makes the process much quicker and ensures clean edges. Each can yielded about 3 circles, and I ended up using 7 cans to make 20 bells. Take each aluminum circle and gently curve it into a bell shape, bringing the edges together. Trim the bottom edge to make it as even as possible so the bell sits flush. Use hot glue to seal the edges together. Be careful, the metal conducts heat and can get very hot. I use scissors to hold and press the edges together to avoid burning my fingers. Sometimes the hot glue may come undone, so you might have to reapply it a few times. Once the edges were sealed, I applied a bit of hot glue to the bell's surface and then pressed in botanical-themed stamps, which I found at Dollar Tree. Let the glue dry completely before carefully removing the stamp. This creates a lovely botanical imprint on the bell. I added 2 to 3 imprints per bell to cover the surface. Cut small pieces of craft wire and create a tiny loop at one end using your scissors. Insert the wire through the top of the bell and secure it with hot glue. Let it set before handling. If needed, trim any uneven edges at the bottom of the bell for a clean finish. Finally, spray paint the bells with gold spray paint. Give them a couple of light coats for an even polished finish. And that's it, here's how they turned out. These little bells are charming, budget-friendly, and add a beautiful handcrafted touch to your holiday decor. For this project, I was inspired by a stunning large embossed bell I saw on Raz Imports. To create something similar, I used the same hot glue stamping technique from our previous DIY on a bell I picked up from Hobby Lobby. It was originally $11.99, but I got it during a 50% off sale. First, I removed the bow and greenery attached to the top of the bell. Next, I added hot glue in shapes approximating the Dollar Tree botanical stamps I was using. Press the stamp into the hot glue while it's still warm, let it dry completely, and then peel off the stamp. I repeated this process using various stamps until the entire bell was covered in botanical patterns. Once the glue patterns were fully set, I painted the bell with 2 coats of chalk paint in the color Castle. After the base coat dried, I lightly brushed white chalk paint over the raised relief patterns. This added a beautiful contrast and helped the botanical design stand out. For the finishing touch, I added a ribbon from Hobby Lobby. I pinched 2 loops of ribbon between my fingers and secured them with craft wire. Then, I cut another piece of ribbon to cover the wire and flipped it to use the red reverse side for additional contrast. I trimmed the tails at a diagonal, then attached the ribbon to the top of the bell with hot glue. This bell turned out beautifully. It was my first time trying this glue stamping technique, and I'm so happy with how these projects came together. This book project was inspired by a beautiful moss-covered book I saw on Pinterest. I loved how it evoked the feeling of a garden brought to life. I started with a large hardcover book, an old craft book from the 90s. Using tacky spray adhesive, I pressed preserved moss from Amazon onto the front cover and spine of the book. While the tacky spray worked well for the base layer, the thicker moss pieces tended to come loose. To address this, I used a combination of tacky spray and hot glue to secure stubborn spots. I left the back cover bare to ensure the book would lay flush on any surface. Once the moss was secure, I noticed some of the book's original blue color was still visible. To blend it in, I painted the edges with chalk paint in the color Spanish moss. The book still felt like it needed something extra, so I experimented with florals. White flowers felt too spring-like, but thrifted holly picks gave the perfect festive touch. I shaped the holly picks into the word joy for simplicity. Since the picks were wire-based, they were easy to bend into shape. I secured them to the moss with hot glue. For a final touch, I added 2 tiny pine cones repurposed from our earlier bell DIY project. They fit perfectly and added a natural charm. The moss-covered book felt a little short on its own, so I decided to add another book underneath for extra height. I used an old craft book and painted the cover with Spanish moss chalk paint. Since it would be mostly hidden, I kept it simple with just 1 coat. To decorate the spine, I filled botanical finial molds with hot glue. Once dry, I trimmed off any stray edges. I painted the leaf finial designs with Spanish moss chalk paint and edged them with a silver marker from Dollar Tree. The The larger finial was painted with oatmeal chalk paint and accented with cardinal red acrylic paint. I originally planned to fully paint the larger finial red, but I loved the neutral base peeking through, so I went light with the red. Once everything dried, I hot glued the finials to the spine of the second book. And that's it. These decorated books make such a whimsical and festive display, blending natural elements with a touch of vintage charm. For this project, I was inspired by the sugar pine cones I found at Home Depot. Typically, sugar pine cones can be quite expensive, but I was lucky to find both plain and frosted varieties for just $4.98 each, so I stocked up. I started by attaching wooden skewers to the base of the pine cones. While the skewers weren't super sturdy because of the pine cone's weight, they worked well enough to secure everything together later. I added hot glue to reinforce the connection. Next, I gathered an assortment of faux greenery from previous projects, including some pine branches, and arranged them alongside the pine cones. Once I was happy with the placement, I tied the bundle together with string to keep everything secure. I initially tried wrapping the stems with ribbon from Hobby Lobby, but it didn't give me the look I wanted. Instead, I used a piece of burlap fabric I had on hand to cover the sticks and finished it off with a small wrap of ribbon for a polished touch. This bouquet works beautifully as a standalone project. It could sit in a vase or be used as a centerpiece. However, if you watched our Greenhouse Decorate With Me video, you'll know I ended up placing it in a basket, and I think that choice elevated the look perfectly. If you're enjoying this video so far, please give it a like to help more people join in on the DIYing fun. For this project, I'm upgrading a basket I thrifted from Goodwill using some drop cloth canvas that perfectly matches our neutral color scheme. I measured the length around the basket and decided how wide I wanted the fabric to be. Then I marked and cut the fabric to fit. My cutting wasn't perfect, so I evened out any rough edges and then distressed the fabric by pulling at some loose threads to create a worn, frayed look. I used Velcro squares and secured them to the ends of the fabric with hot glue. If you don't have Velcro, you can glue the fabric directly together. But I prefer Velcro because it allows me to easily remove or reuse the cover on other baskets. Next, I designed a logo in Cricut Design Space and cut out a stencil on acetate. If you choose to make your own design, make sure all your letters are connected so that they stay intact when cut. I made a mistake here and had to use tape to reattach the detachable parts of the letters. It worked fine, but it's definitely easier to get it right during the design phase. I lined up the stencil where I wanted it on the fabric and secured it with duct tape. You could also use painter's tape or masking tape. Whatever you have on hand works. The logo, Frost to Bloom, is inspired by our Minnesota garden, which I like to refer to as Frost to Bloom gardening. Since this theme celebrates nature, I thought it was the perfect phrase to incorporate into our decor. Using chalk paint and the color Castle, I filled in the stencil with a paintbrush. Once it dried, I removed the stencil. Quick tip: to prevent paint from bleeding under the stencil, you can apply a thin layer of Mod Podge before painting. I skipped this step so I had a little bleeding, but I think it adds to the rustic and natural charm of the design. To clean up some of the letters, I used chalk paint in the color Oatmeal, which was similar to the fabric color, and touched up some of the rougher edges. Once everything dried, I reattached the fabric cover to the basket. As you might have seen in our Decorate With Me video, it looks wonderful hanging on the wall filled with greenery. Next up, I'm building a wooden tree box stand using fence picket boards, which are an affordable option, typically between $1 and $3 per board at most home improvement stores. I started by measuring the width and height of the Christmas tree stand, deciding on a box that was approximately 18 by 18 inches and about 12 inches tall. Next, I measured and cut 4 pieces of scrap 2x4s down to 12 inches to serve as support beams for attaching the fence picket boards. Then I measured and cut the fence picket boards. From each fence picket board, I was able to get 3 cuts, and I used a total of 3 boards. Quick tip: when cutting wood with a saw, always add about 1/8 inch to your measurements to account for the width of the saw blade. With all the cuts made, I used a handheld nailer to attach the fence picket boards to the 2x4 supports. For the first board, I used some leftover cedar shingles as shims to keep it properly aligned. I put 3 to 4 nails down each side, using a hammer to drive in any stubborn nails that didn't sink in fully. I continued this process until all the boards were securely attached. I'll admit I made a miscalculation. My intention was for the box to completely cover the tree stand, but I didn't factor in the space taken up by the 2x4 supports. When I tried to fit the tree stand, the supports blocked it from fitting inside. If you're building something similar, make sure to add extra length to your measurements to account for your supports. But don't worry, I found a fix and I'll show you in just a bit. I gave the box a light sanding to smooth out any rough edges. Then I applied a watered down coat of chalk paint in the color oatmeal. The paint is subtle because I wanted to keep the natural wood grain visible, but it added a nice warmth to the wood. Using the stencil from our previous project, I taped it down to the wood and filled it in with castle-colored chalk paint. However, I realized the gray didn't pop enough, so I went over it again with black acrylic paint. Again, using Mod Podge before stenciling helps prevent paint from bleeding under the stencil. I skipped this step as I was a little impatient, and as expected, I had significant bleed through. To clean it up, I used a fine brush and touched up the edges with oatmeal-colored chalk paint. To resolve the sizing issue, I added nails in the corners of the box to create small supports for the tree stand to rest on. Fortunately, the stand was hollow, so it fit securely on top of the nails. Even though it was a mistake, the final result did add a bit of extra height to the tree, which I think actually worked, and I just covered the tree stand with some burlap. And that's it. The finished tree box has a rustic, cozy charm and complements the overall theme beautifully. I was inspired by a hanging basket I spotted on Raz Imports and thought a similar basket would add a nice touch to our seating area. I started with some faux pine picks I purchased from Hobby Lobby last year. I attached 2 picks together at the base and top using craft wire, arranging the branches to flare out on both sides. To add a festive pop of color, I included a holly berry pick. Next, I measured and cut squares of burlap to wrap around the base of the greenery. Once wrapped, I secured the burlap with twine for a rustic finish. I placed the burlap-wrapped greenery into hanging fruit baskets I purchased from Amazon. For the front of the baskets, I painted wood rounds with chalk paint in the color sheepskin in the center, leaving the edges natural. While the paint dried, I used the bird song mold from IOD to cast 4 birds using hot glue. Once set, I painted the birds with acrylic paint in the color cardinal red. While the birds dried, I stamped the edges of the wood rounds with the botanical-themed stamps from Dollar Tree. After everything dried, I glued the birds to the wood rounds with hot glue. To enhance the design, I colored the bird beaks and highlighted the raised edges of the birds with a gold leaf pen. Using a small drill bit, I drilled holes on either side of the wood rounds. I threaded craft wire through the holes and attached the rounds securely to the front of the basket. And that's it. These chair hangers turned out beautifully and add a festive yet rustic charm to our seating area. Speaking of the dining area, the wicker chairs we used in our decor video were thrifted from Goodwill for $14.99 each. While they were in pretty good shape overall, they needed a good cleaning and some minor repairs. I cleaned the chairs on my deck using soap, water, and disinfectant to ensure they were fresh and ready for use. To repair the damaged areas, I purchased chair cane from Amazon. I haven't attempted to repair a wicker chair before, but I figured I could fill in some of the wicker that had cracked or that was missing. The cane was easy to cut with craft scissors. I cut small pieces to match and fill the damaged areas of the chairs. In most cases, I was able to weave the cane into the existing wicker without glue. It stayed surprisingly secure on its own. For areas where weaving wasn't possible, I used hot glue to secure the pieces. While I was initially worried that hot glue might not hold out in the long term, it's been holding up really well so far. The original chairs had a dingy gray color, so to brighten them up and blend in the repairs, I painted them with a fresh coat of chalk paint in the color chiffon cream. While these chairs weren't the showstoppers of our holiday decor, sprucing them up provided a nice base for our setup. Plus, they're now great garden chairs that I hope will last for years to come. Still focusing on the dining area, we're creating some table centerpieces inspired by a tea tin floral arrangement I saw on Pinterest. I happen to have some old tea tins on hand, so I gave them 2 coats of chalk paint in the color Castle. Once the paint dried, I used the Dollar Tree botanical stamps from the previous projects to stamp botanical patterns onto the tea tins. To build the floral arrangement, I placed floral foam inside each tin. I arranged some white flowers from Amazon and added faux pine branches left over from other projects. The result is a simple yet wintry floral arrangement that feels both festive and fresh. This next project was a last-minute addition to the table. I had picked up these terrarium domes from Dollar Tree because they fit perfectly with the Apothecary theme, but as the theme got built out, these domes got dropped as a project. In the end, the table felt like it could use something else, so I brought these back. I painted the base of the domes with chalk paint in the color Castle. Once the paint dried, I added leftover moss from the moss book project. I decided not to glue down the moss so I could reuse the domes in future projects, but if you want a more permanent design, feel free to glue everything in place. To finish, I added a few bottle brush trees on top of the moss. The result, a quick, easy, and enchanting centerpiece that ties beautifully into the overall theme. If you watched our Decorate With Me video, you might have noticed the cloches we used on the dining table. I wanted to create a feast under glass concept to complement the Apothecary theme of our table setting. For this project, I used clear plastic buckets from Dollar Tree as makeshift cloches. The buckets had a small bump on the bottom, which became the top when flipped upside down. To disguise this bump and add both a pop of red and a functional handle, I decided to cast roses using hot glue. I filled rose-shaped silicone molds with hot glue and let them set completely. Once set, I painted the roses with acrylic paint in the color Cardinal Red. After the paint dried, I used hot glue to attach the roses to the top of each bucket, creating both a decorative and practical handle for the cloches. These turned out beautifully, adding a unique and whimsical touch to the table while tying into the overall Apothecary aesthetic. I was loosely inspired by a stunning cascading wreath I saw on Pinterest from an Etsy shop called Virgie's Treasures. Since we're decorating our greenhouse, I had the unique opportunity to create 2 wreaths, one for each door. I started with a leaf garland from Joann Fabric, which I picked up during a fall sale at 50% off. While the leaves were beautiful, their fall tones didn't quite fit our more neutral holiday color palette, and the orange hues didn't feel very Christmassy. I wasn't sure how to fix this until I saw Katya Nicolaju here on YouTube painting leaves, and I decided to give it a try. I painted the leaves with a base coat of Spanish moss chalk paint. Once that dried, I went back in with a green acrylic paint to add depth and variation. This step was a bit tedious and took about an hour in total, but the results were absolutely worth it. Off camera, I cut the leaf garland in half, along with another floral garland I planned to layer on top. I hooked the leaf garland into the thrifted grapevine wreath and secured it with craft wire. Then I layered the floral garland on top, arranging it before securing it with more craft wire. The wreath still felt like it needed something, so I added holly picks that I thrifted and also used in our moss book project. These holly picks have wire stems, which made it easy to hook them into the wreath for a secure hold. Next, I made a large bow using ribbon from Hobby Lobby. I held the ribbon up to the wreath to gauge the right size for the loops and cut the ribbon accordingly. I secured the ends of the ribbon with hot glue, creating one loop, and added a smaller piece of ribbon flipped outward to create a pop of red for the bow center. I glued this to the center of the bow. I debated adding ribbon tails, but ultimately decided against it for a cleaner look. For the second wreath, I repeated the same process but flipped the placement of the leaves and garland. This mirroring effect allowed the wreaths to frame the greenhouse doors beautifully, creating a cohesive and symmetrical look. I felt like something was still missing. After playing around with a few ideas, I settled on these large solar-activated ornaments from Dollar Tree. They filled the center space perfectly and added a light feature for some extra holiday magic. I secured them in place with craft wire. And that's it. These wreaths turned out to be stunning statement pieces for the greenhouse, combining natural charm, festive accents, and even a nice light feature. Wow, we just made it through 14 DIY projects. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you so much. And if you missed our Decorate With Me video where we used all of these DIY projects to transform our greenhouse for the holidays, be sure to check it out next. You'll find the link in the description box below. And remember, enchantment awaits. Life is just about finding it.